I'm here in Traverse City, Michigan, where I've been outfitting my 1963 Pearson Triton. Still working on it. She's out in the boatyard. Let's go see what I've done so far. One of the things I like about the Pearson Triton is that it has a keel-hung rudder. But one of the things I don't like about the rudder, this rudder, is that it's the original rudder. And they were originally made of wood. You can see that the wood has been laminated together and those laminations are separating. That meant I needed to do something to repair it. So I wedged the laminations open a little bit and then mixed up some epoxy using Total Boat fast hardening epoxy as well as silica thickener. The thickener is extremely fine powder and it's used to create a smooth and non-sagging high-strength mixture for structural bonding. When you mix the epoxy with the thickener, you want to get a really good thick consistency like toothpaste or mayonnaise. Once I had it all mixed together, I then went about squeezing it in the best I could into the gaps that I had opened up. From there, I used a pipe clamp to squeeze it together and let it set overnight. After it had set, I removed all the masking tape that I had used to prevent the epoxy from just covering all the surface and being more difficult to remove. And then I used a random orbital sander to sand off everything and make the surface nice and smooth for finishing. I gave everything a few days to just fully cure, and then I used Total Boat's Total Protect. Total Protect is an epoxy primer and barrier coat. It's a 3-to-1 ratio, so you mix it 3 parts of the base with 1 part of the curing agent, and then you need to mix it thoroughly. You can brush or roll it on, but you don't want the application to be too thick. I started off with brushing in the hard to reach areas, and from there used a roller with a very thin nap. Once the entire surface was coated, I left it to sit for 7 days before coming back and painting over it with some undercoat. I couldn't find any bottom coat paint that would match the current color of my hull, but I found black, and I figured black is good enough for a rudder. It's below the water line, no one would see it, and the main thing is that I had laminated up the rudder, given it some protection with the Total Protect, and then also coated it with a couple final coats of a barrier paint. Up on deck, I wanted to remove the icebox. There was a hatch to the icebox, and the icebox was actually within the cabin. There were no hinges holding the icebox, and I would never use the icebox. So first, I had to grind down the surface to make it flush so that I could put in a panel and fiberglass over so that it would match the rest of the cockpit surface. I cut a piece of plywood to fit, and while I was at it, I cut a couple other pieces of plywood that I would use as bulkheads in the rear lazaret, which I was converting into a rear engine well. I had a few other problem areas in the deck surface. I had the hole where the gas intake once was. I also had some cracks and damage around one of the stanchion posts. There were in fact a lot of little cracks in the surface, so I sanded it all down and prepared to do some repair work. Once again, I turned to Total Boat's fast hardening epoxy resin and applied 1 layer of 10-ounce fiberglass and epoxied it down to the piece of plywood that would cover the icebox opening. There were other pieces of plywood that I'd cut out for the bulkheads, and while I was at it, I took care of adding some fiberglass to those as well. A part of that process was also trimming off the excess fiberglass from the edges of the panels so that they would fit in place properly. From there, I dusted and cleaned all the surfaces. I used some acetone to clean the surfaces thoroughly to ensure that the epoxy resin would have a nice clean surface to adhere to. I traced out the size and the shape of the holes onto some parchment paper, which is semi-translucent. And then with my parchment pattern, I laid the fiberglass on top and traced those same patterns out onto the fiberglass. I laid the different pieces of fiberglass on the parchment paper and applied the epoxy resin directly on, and then from there, lay the entire piece down as a patch onto the deck. I applied a little more epoxy resin to help it adhere to the deck, and then before it reached a full cure, I added a few more pieces of patches to the largest hole where the gas tank intake was. It was a big glassing day and also a good day, seeing some progress being made into repairing the damage that I had done, tearing everything apart. The next day after everything had cured, I began to clean it up, first trimming away the excess material and then using my rasp, which is basically a very coarse file. I used the rasp to smooth and fair out some of the surface so that it would have a more uniform shape, and then used my orbital sander again with very coarse 60 grit sandpaper. With those areas finished off, I've moved on to installing the bulkheads. I also created a lamination for the engine mount in the engine well. I had to make sure that I added a radius to the top edge so that the fiberglass would easily contour over. Once again, I cleaned all the surfaces where I would be installing the bulkheads, wiped everything down with acetone, and then began the installation process. Again, I used some thickened epoxy for the initial setting up, and then later I taped everything in with some 10-ounce cloth and more epoxy resin. I added some vertical pieces that would box in the engine well and planned out where I would cut the actual through hole. I would need to remove this knee that the chain plate was attached to and had to plan accordingly so as to not take off too much, but to still have enough clearance. This was a bit of a nervous moment for me, cutting away an important part of the boat. In the future, I'll move the chain plates and have 2 at the rear corners. For now, I believe removing a small piece won't affect the integrity because the Triton was very heavily built, and as it turned out, this knee piece was made of solid oak. It was incredibly hard to cut through, and my cutting disc didn't reach all the way through, so I had to resort to chiseling it out by hand. A little time consuming, but with a little bit of effort, it was finally out. Next, I used a hole saw and cut through the hull. Look how thick this is, 1 inch thick at the transom. It's no wonder why some of these old boats are considered bulletproof if they're taken care of. After a few weeks, I took a drive to Harrison Power Sports. Okay, so I've driven 1.5 hours. I'm down at Harrison Power Sports to pick up my new Tohatsu 6 horsepower Sailpro ultra long shaft outboard engine. It's a lot to say. Anyway, weather's not great and I got a lot of work to do back at the boat, so I'm gonna get this uncrated, load it in the car, and head out. Back at the boatyard, I installed the engine mount into the engine wheel, using some duct tape and some clamps to jerry-rig it into the right position, and then epoxy it in place. I then added some diagonal support pieces, and then covered those support pieces, and eventually would fiberglass them and make them watertight. From there, I lifted the motor into place and tested out to make sure the fit was right. So far so good, and an indication of what things might look like. From there, I started to build the box, or the actual engine compartment. I used 1/2-inch plywood cut to size, thickened epoxy to glue the boards together, clamped everything in place, and slowly built it out to shape. In some places I would use screws to secure it to the deck. The screws would be removed later and the holes filled. I used a straight edge along the top surface to make sure everything was squared off. With the engine well roughed in, it was now time to begin fairing, and I used Total Boat's Total Fair. It's a 2-part epoxy fairing compound. You can see how the deck work I did was quite rough and uneven in surface areas. The Total Fair would be used to smooth everything out and make level surfaces throughout the deck area. I had a few different tools to use, different paint and putty scrapers, as well as plastic spreaders. Like before, the process began with cleaning the entire surface, making it as dust-free as possible, and then wiping everything down with acetone. The Total Fair was very easy to use. It's a 2-part fairing compound and 2 different colors. You simply scoop out 2 equal parts and then mix them together. As you mix, the yellow and the blue become green. You continue to mix until there's no swirls of any of the original colors, and you have a consistent green putty mixture. I put down some number markers on the most important areas that I wanted to cover with the fairing compound so that I would be sure not to miss any. I tried to make everything as smooth as possible, but I also knew that this would be more than a single application. When I had finished off my first application of the fairing compound, I went over it with a straight edge and with a pencil marked all the low spots so that I'd easily be able to see where to add more of the fairing compound. They recommend that you don't really apply much more than 1/3 of an inch during each application. After the fairing compound had had a day to sit and cure, it was now sanding time, and there was a lot of sanding. Once it was all sanded, the hull was really starting to show what it might look like, albeit it needed a paint job. Any of the low gouges that I had created from using the angle grinder or sanding disc had now been filled with the fairing compound, and the deck surface that I'd been working on for the past 3 weeks was now relatively smooth and even, at least smooth enough that it would look good enough for me for a 60-year-old boat. I spent a little bit more time hand sanding in some of the hard to reach areas that I couldn't get the orbital sander in. As tedious as hand sanding can be, it was important for me to spend the time, put a little bit of effort into it, and just try to do the best job that I could in the short amount of time that I had to complete the job. With the hand sanding done, once again, it was time to wipe everything down again. I used a tack cloth, but what's important is that I didn't press hard with the tack cloth. They contain a resin, and I didn't want to spread that resin on the surface. Instead, I just lightly dragged the tack cloth over the surface to pick up some of the loose dust before I wiped everything down with acetone. With the surface all clean, once again, it was time to use Total Boat's Total Protect to create an epoxy primer and barrier coat before the final coating. Due to all the different curves and contours and small areas, it was necessary for me to brush the Total Protect on most of the surface areas that I needed to work on. But where possible, I did also use a roller from time to time. The Total Protect wasn't the final coating, but it did give a consistent coating that I was able to see what the boat was really going to look like. After a day of curing, I then sanded all of the surface again with 220 grit sandpaper. This was to bring the finish from an orange peel type of texture down to more of like an eggshell finish. Again, some time was taken to dust and clean the surface, and then it was time to gel coat. I was using Total Boat's gel coat, both with wax and without wax. My strategy was to do a few coats without wax and then do a final coat with wax. Again, this is a two-part process where you pour in your gel coat and then carefully add in the MEKP, which is the catalyst that hardens the gel coat. With the gel coat finished, it was time to return all of the hardware to the deck that I had removed before beginning all of the work. It had taken me 2 days to remove all of this hardware, and it took me nearly 2 days to put it all back. Now that everything was in place, there was one last step that I had to do, and that was to set up the motor. I definitely wanted to do it right, so I set up a stepladder, clamped a piece of plywood to the top rung, placed a bucket on the plywood, filled it with water, and then placed the shaft of the motor down into the bucket. From there, I added the necessary oil and fuel. The motor has both an internal fuel tank as well as an external fuel tank. And for the setup process, I would use the internal fuel tank first. I started to try to turn the motor over, and this went on for about 2 hours. Nothing. So then I plugged in the external fuel tank, gave it a couple pumps, and then I put the propeller back on, bolted it in place, secured the bolt with the cotter pin, gave the propeller a little spin to make sure it would turn freely, and okay, well, there is a lot of work still to be done, and the boat launches in 4 days.